she wasn't born. She was delivered to a cult that believed she carried the light of God in her blood. In the hidden corners of rural Missouri, there lies a story so disturbing, so buried in silence, that even the locals refuse to speak her name. But in 2024, the truth always finds a way back. This is not your typical true crime case. This is a forgotten chapter in America's dark spiritual history, an alleged child cult survivor, known only as the Vessel, erased from all records, worshipped in secrecy, and hunted for escape. If you're drawn to unsolved cult mysteries, forbidden rituals, child disappearances, and the terrifying truth behind faith-based isolationism, keep watching. Because what you're about to hear was never meant to reach the public. And someone, somewhere, is still watching. They called her Miriam Solis. But that wasn't her real name, and she didn't remember the one she was born with. All she knew was the barn, the cold stone floor, and the prayers that sounded more like chants. From the outside, it looked like a rural ministry, tucked behind overgrown fields in Gasconade County. But inside, it was something else entirely. She was raised without mirrors, without clocks, without choices, taught to believe the world ended at the fence and that her breath existed only to serve the messengers. Locals whispered about the place, but no one dared cross that fence. Until one night, something happened, something that made Miriam run. And what she left behind would lead to one of the darkest, most suppressed cult investigations in modern U.S. history. What was Domus Aurea really hiding behind its golden doors? The first clue came from a single photograph buried in a shoebox. Decades later. If 3 children vanish from the same town and no one calls the cops, what kind of town is that? That was the question that kept circling in Miriam Solis's mind, like a dying radio signal, as she steered her dust-covered Jeep down a cracked 2-lane road in rural Missouri. She wasn't here on assignment. She wasn't even supposed to be working. But the story had pulled her in like a black hole. 3 kids missing. 0 media coverage. No active investigation. And a town that responded with silence. Gasconade Ridge wasn't even on most maps anymore. It was the kind of place where cell reception died and locals didn't make eye contact, even when you waved. Miriam had found the first mention of it buried in a Reddit thread titled, "The Town That Forgot Its Children." At first, she thought it was urban legend bait. But then came the names. Real names, real birth certificates, and real obituaries only for the parents, never for the kids. The closer she got, the more her GPS glitched out, showing her location as simply unknown zone. That's when the air changed. The sky looked heavier. The road narrowed. And ahead, half hidden behind rusted mailboxes and overgrown brush, stood a wooden sign with peeling gold paint, "Welcome to Domus Aurea." She hit record on her voice memo. Day 1. If I disappear, this is where to start. She said the name once and then looked over her shoulder, like it might hear her. Miriam hadn't been in town more than an hour before someone pointed her to the edge of a gravel road where the trees leaned too close, and time seemed to slow. That's where she met Judith Miller, 83 years old, sharp as glass, and the only person within a 100-mile radius who dared whisper the words Domus Aurea. Her house looked like it hadn't changed since 1971. Lace curtains yellowed from decades of nicotine and grief, ceramic angels on every flat surface, and a shotgun resting quietly behind the door, dusted but loaded. "They'll come if they know you're asking," Judith said flatly as she poured lukewarm tea into a chipped floral cup. "So ask quiet." Miriam leaned in. "What is Domus Aurea?" Judith smiled, but her eyes didn't. "It's not a place, honey. It's a belief. A cage dressed like heaven." Miriam's recorder blinked red. She barely breathed. Judith told her about the singing that started after midnight, the children walking barefoot through frost, and the fires that never left smoke. She paused, then whispered. They said the girl glowed, that she didn't cast a shadow. Miriam blinked, unsure if she heard that right. Judith just stared back. She's still out there, or what's left of her. And that's when Miriam realized this wasn't just a cult story. This was a haunting. She was just a child. But to them, she was the vessel of light. Judith didn't raise her voice when she said it, but the room seemed to shrink, the air turning thick like wet wool. Miriam sat frozen, her tea untouched, the recorder still blinking red but somehow feeling useless against the weight of those words. Judith's eyes didn't blink. They called her Ilara, said she was born with no sin, no shadow, no fear, said her breath could bless the soil. Miriam wanted to push, ask more, but her throat tightened. Something about the way Judith spoke made it feel less like a memory and more like a confession. She was 8 when they took her. Judith whispered. They paraded her barefoot through the hills, painted her in ash, called her the bridge between heaven and fire, said Domus Aurea had been waiting for her since the flood. Miriam scribbled the name Ilara, but her pen trembled. Judith continued. No one ever saw her eat. She'd just sit, still as the grave, eyes wide, humming to things no one else heard. Then Judith leaned closer, her voice barely audible. They didn't think she was human. They thought she was sent. Miriam's heart pounded. The deeper she listened, the more one truth became clear: this wasn't folklore. This was a living secret, and someone had gone to great lengths to bury it. What if everything you've been told about small towns and lost girls was a carefully curated lie? As Miriam scrolled through decades-old news clippings and police reports sealed with unusual haste, one disturbing pattern emerged: every family tied to Domus Aurea vanished without formal trace, as if erased with intent, not accident. The missing weren't runaways or addicts. They were farmers, teachers, children, good people, gone quiet. Locals spoke in unfinished sentences, broke eye contact at key names, and churches near the village kept their doors bolted long after sunset. It wasn't just fear, it was complicity. And as Miriam pushed deeper, she uncovered something chilling: multiple sightings of a barefoot child, still glowing, still humming, reported as recently as 2022. Could Ilara still be alive? Or had the cult found a new vessel? What came next would unravel the very fabric of everything Miriam thought she understood about faith, control, and legacy. Because Judith's warnings were only the beginning, and the real horror waited beneath the chapel floor. Her name was Leora. No last name, no birth records, just a child no older than 6 who appeared at the edge of the woods in the fall of 1969, barefoot, silent, and alone. Judith remembered it vividly, not because it was strange, but because no one else acted like it was. The townspeople simply took her in, built a story around her like they'd been expecting her all along. She walked right up to the chapel steps, Judith said, voice tight. And the pastor didn't ask where she came from. He just opened the door. From that moment on, Leora became part of the fabric of Domus Aurea. No school, no doctor visits, no legal documents, yet no one questioned it. She would appear at harvest blessings, funerals, even weddings, always dressed in white, always surrounded by whispers. Judith recalled how animals would follow her: crows, foxes, once even a wounded buck, as if drawn by something primal. Miriam asked if anyone tried to find her family. Judith just shook her head. They said she was from before. She murmured. Before time. Before sin. The more Miriam heard, the more reality frayed at the edges. Because if Leora wasn't found, was she sent? That simple question would spiral into a darkness far deeper than Miriam had ever prepared for. They called it the Irenaeus Trust, a name whispered with reverence, not fear, which made it even more unsettling. According to Judith, that was the only traceable origin of Leora. The villagers would say she came from a children's care center run by the Trust, a supposedly philanthropic group that no one could quite define. No official records, no inspections, no government oversight. Yet no one in Domus Aurea questioned its presence. Judith said the Trust would send envelopes, no stamps, just wax seals and hand-delivered by men in dark wool coats who never spoke a word. Every envelope came with instructions, dates, offerings, names. Leora's arrival was one such instruction. She was marked as Vessel 3B, verified in one of the ledgers Judith had stolen years ago and hidden beneath a loose plank in her floor. Miriam was stunned. How could something so orchestrated, so systemic, go unnoticed by the authorities? Judith leaned closer, her voice sharp as rusted wire. Because the Trust isn't local, it's old, and it's everywhere. Online searches led nowhere. No website, no press. Not even conspiracy threads dared mention it by name. The deeper Miriam looked, the clearer it became this wasn't just about a child. It was about control, legacy, and a network more ancient than government itself. And Leora, she wasn't the first. The first villagers who interacted with Leora teachers, the town nurse, even Father Donnelly began to behave differently. It started subtly blank stares held too long, murmured phrases in languages no one recognized, waking up in the middle of the night to stand outside her cottage in complete silence. Miriam, notebook trembling in her hand, listened as Judith described the change with a mixture of dread and certainty. They said she had the light, Judith whispered, voice barely audible. But what I saw was something else. They called it devotion. Judith called it possession. One man dug an 8-foot trench in his backyard and filled it with candles, claiming it was where the memory of light should rest. The town librarian burned every copy of the Bible and replaced them with hand-bound books containing strange diagrams and symbols. None of them remembered doing it, or so they claimed. Miriam leaned in, unsettled. What was it? Judith. The old woman's hands trembled as she lit a single match and let it burn close to her skin. She didn't speak. But you heard her. Inside your mind. Leora wasn't just a child. She was a conduit, and whatever spoke through her wasn't from here. And that's when Miriam knew. Whatever was buried in this village had only just begun to wake. The deeper Miriam dug, the stranger the village became missing. Reports erased, death certificates rewritten, and a timeline that didn't make sense. What began as whispers grew into unshakable dread. Domus Aurea wasn't just a name. It was a pattern, a recurring ritual across decades. The deeper she followed the threads, the more they pulled her toward the one night in 1974 when everything unraveled. What happened that night? Judith's voice cracked as she said, "That's when the real darkness began." Inside the isolated heart of Domus Aurea, hidden behind moss-covered stone walls and forgotten paths, stood a structure no map acknowledged, the inner orchard. It wasn't a place for children. It was a place of silence, of control, of deliberate unknowing. At just 7 years old, Leora was led behind those doors alone. From that moment on, she was cut off from the outside world. No school, no contact, no sunlight except the slivers that broke through cracked stained glass. They said the inner orchard was a place of spiritual refinement. But what Judith described sounded more like psychological entrapment. The walls were covered in faded murals of eyes and branches, and each child was given a mask to wear a face not their own. Leora's voice was not heard for years. They stripped her identity and replaced it with prophecy. She was not allowed to speak unless spoken through. Judith whispered, her fingers trembling as they traced the rim of her teacup. She became a vessel, not a girl. The other children gone. No records. No graves. No names. Only she remained, and no one knows why. But this was just the beginning of what Domus Aurea demanded. The worst was yet to come. She never spoke. Not a word. Not a sound. But whenever Leora appeared, something shifted in the air, a gravity that pulled people to their knees, as if some invisible force demanded it. Even the adults, the ones who once ran the village with pride and skepticism, bowed without question. It was as if her silence carried the weight of divinity, or domination. Judith leaned closer, eyes glassy, voice barely above a whisper. They didn't kneel out of love. They knelt out of fear. No one was allowed to touch her, not even the caretakers. Only one person had permission, a figure known only as the White Custodian. Dressed in ceremonial white robes, face covered by a porcelain mask with no mouth, he or it was the sole link between Leora and the rest of the world. Judith described moments where villagers would glimpse them at dawn, the custodian guiding her barefoot through fog, her feet never seeming to leave a mark. No one ever saw where she slept, what she ate, or if she cried. And still no words. Just presence. Just power. We were told she was purity, Judith said, but it felt like standing next to a storm that never broke. And then came the rituals. The ones no one was supposed to survive. Judith's voice trembled as she described what no child should have ever witnessed: Leora's first ritual inside the sanctum. It was called the Arrival of Bloom, but there was nothing beautiful about it. The room, hidden deep beneath the chapel, was ice cold, a chilling 38 degrees, enough to see your breath even in complete silence. Yet the room was lined with wildflowers, freshly cut and unnaturally vibrant, as if they were preserved by something other than nature. In the center, a circular stone platform bathed in orange candlelight flickered with a strange glow. 12 hooded figures formed a ring, chanting in a language no one could recognize. Not Latin, not Greek, something older. And at the center stood Leora, barefoot, silent, and wrapped in white linen. In one corner, a bronze bowl held fire. In the other, a silver one held blood. Judith gasped when she said that the blood didn't come from animals. They made her stand there for hours. She whispered. And the moment the fire met the blood, every candle in the room went out on its own. People in the circle collapsed, some crying, others seizing. But Leora didn't blink. She didn't move. She didn't even shiver. And when it was over, they called her the Vessel. What followed next still haunts the ones who survived. But here's where everything spirals into the terrifying unknown. What happened inside that cold chamber didn't stay there. In the weeks that followed, those who witnessed the ritual began to vanish one by one, without warning, without a trace. Some were found wandering in the woods, muttering nonsense. Others were never found at all. And Judith, the only one who remembers it all, claims it was never just about Leora. She leans closer, her eyes wild with memory, and says, they wanted something through her. And once it opened, it never fully closed. What exactly was it? That's where Miriam's investigation takes a dark, irreversible turn. And the next name she finds in the town records is the final piece that shatters everything. Miriam dug deeper through sealed county records, forgotten obituaries, and a locked filing cabinet hidden in the back room of the abandoned church, and what she uncovered wasn't just unsettling, it was reality-breaking. Domus Aurea wasn't some isolated village cult. It was an experimental branch of a far-reaching, ultra-elite society, funded by shadowy tycoons from the 1950s, whose names still appear on hospital wings, museums, and Ivy League donor walls. These weren't just rich men, they were architects of power, and they believed that through Leora, they could access something beyond human comprehension. Rituals weren't superstition, they were strategy. The inner orchard wasn't a chapel, it was a gateway. And the most chilling part, Miriam finds proof that this wasn't the only site. There were others, coast to coast, hidden in plain sight. Her hands shook as she held a faded blueprint marked with the symbol Judith had described, a sun within a cage. The same symbol etched into the wood beneath the altar. The same symbol on the check that funded the Irenaeus Trust. Everything she thought was folklore now had a bank account. And the next revelation would be even worse. They didn't just worship her, they believed she wasn't human. To the elders of Domus Aurea, Leora was the vessel, not a title, but a function. A sacred container chosen by ancient design. Because in their doctrine, the light of God, pure, undiluted divinity, could only be reborn through a body untouched by the world. That meant no parents, no history, no legal existence, and most importantly, no voice. A child with no name to tether her to humanity. No records to trace her origins. No words to interrupt the rituals. They called it the doctrine of hollow light. She was purity by design. A blank slate. The ideal host. Judith whispered that those who chose her believed silence was the proof. If she cried, if she screamed, the light could shatter. So instead, they made her mute through ritual. Not medical, not physical, something older. And that's why no one touched her. That's why even the most devout followers would tremble when she entered a room. To them, she wasn't a girl. She was the doorway. And Miriam was about to learn what that doorway led to. In a locked drawer beneath layers of dust and forgotten warnings, Miriam found what no one was ever meant to see. Classified notes dated October 17th, 1971, marked with a symbol she had seen only once before, the sigil of Domus Aurea, etched above the altar of the inner orchard. The pages were brittle. The ink faded. But the message hit like a scream in a cathedral. Subject attempted breach at 2:44 a.m. Protocol Theta activated. No external witnesses. Subject now untraceable. No name. No photo. Just one word. Underlined 3 times in red: Leora. It was the first and last record of her trying to escape. But where did she go? Why did all documentation end that night? And why did none of the surviving villagers ever speak of it? One page mentioned a fire. Another, later censored, hinted at biological dissociation, a term Miriam couldn't even find in academic texts. But the most chilling line came at the bottom of a torn memo. Light must be contained. If the vessel fractures, all balance is lost. That's when Miriam realized Leora hadn't just disappeared. She had been erased. Not lost, but buried under layers of fear, silence, and something far more deliberate. And what Miriam would discover next would change everything. Judith's voice trembled not from age, but from memory. In the dim candlelight of her study, surrounded by relics of a past too heavy to name, she finally whispered what no one else had dared to admit for over 5 decades. "It was me," she said, her eyes glassing over. "I opened the door that night. I let her run. For a moment, time fractured." Miriam stared, unsure if she had heard correctly. Judith continued, her words cracking like dry wood. "She wasn't supposed to know there was a door. No one did. But Leora found it. She looked at me not with fear, but with hope. And I knew. I knew I couldn't let them take her to the Hollow Room. The Hollow Room. A place Miriam had only seen mentioned once, always redacted, always followed by the phrase irreversible phenomena. Judith confessed she had waited for that exact moment for years, hiding the key in her locket, praying she'd never have to use it. But when she saw the blood on Leora's gown after the ceremony, something inside her broke. They called her the Light, Judith said, but what they wanted was control. I couldn't be part of it anymore. And just when Miriam thought the truth had peaked, Judith reached into a box and pulled out something wrapped in velvet, an object that would rip reality wide open. No one ever found Leora again. Not a trace. Not a footprint. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her. But from the moment she vanished through that emergency door, the village once cloaked in eerie calm began to collapse from within. The trees around Domus Aurea started to rot from the inside out. Birds stopped singing. Livestock turned feral. A thick fog settled over the valley and never lifted. The villagers, once devout and blind, whispered of curses, of broken covenants. They said the light had left them, and in her place, only punishment remained. The inner orchard was shut down, sealed in iron and scripture. But it didn't matter. People disappeared. Children woke up screaming in languages no one had taught them. Elders gouged out their own eyes, murmuring about visions of mirrors and thorns. Judith called it the Great Unraveling. Miriam called it what it was, a systemic spiritual collapse. And yet, the cult's higher branches never returned to retrieve their vessel. That was the most disturbing part. Either they no longer needed her, or what had escaped was no longer theirs to control. Judith leaned in and whispered, "You think she ran away, but what if she ran towards something, and that changed everything?" They thought the story ended with her disappearance. But stories like these don't end. They echo quietly, violently, endlessly. Decades later, a faded tape emerged. No label. Just a recording of a child humming a melody no one should know. In the background, the chime of bells from Domus Aurea. And her voice, older now, sharper, whispering. They thought I was the light, but I was the mirror. Suddenly, fringe forums reignited. Survivors came forward. Journalists disappeared mid-investigation. Every clue led back to one name etched in trembling ink: Leora. But the real question wasn't what happened to her. It was, what did she become? Because some say she's still here. Watching. Waiting. And every time a child goes missing without records, without prints, without sound, there's one phrase scratched into the wall: the orchard blooms again. Which brings us to the final piece, the question no one dares to ask out loud, but everyone feels tightening around their throat like a cold breath in the dark. Miriam thought she'd reached the end of the trail until she found it. Buried in a rusted file cabinet beneath layers of sealed boxes in an abandoned records room at a long-defunct psychiatric hospital in Idaho, a medical report dated 1986. No name, no family, but a fingerprint. And when cross-referenced with the encrypted files smuggled out of Domus Aurea, it matched Leora, 30 years later, alive, but barely recognizable. The notes described her as non-verbal, sensitive to light, obsessed with mirrors. And one final entry: patient hums melody identical to tape found in 1971 ritual footage. What's worse, the hospital burned down 3 days after that record was written. No survivors. No explanation. Only one scorched frame remained, a photograph of a girl in a white gown, staring blankly through one-way glass. Miriam's hands trembled as she read the final notation on the chart. She doesn't age. Was she a victim? Or something else entirely? What if Leora never escaped? What if she was never meant to? And what if, just maybe, Domus Aurea wasn't a cult, but a containment facility? The question isn't where is she now, but who is she watching next? The final line of the file wasn't typed. It was scratched into the paper with what looked like the tip of a broken pen. The ink jagged and desperate. Subject refuses to speak. Draws only spirals and stars. No name, no diagnosis, no discharge. Just that. Spirals over and over again. Some perfect, some violent, some so dense the paper tore through. Stars lopsided, childlike, but always in sevens. Miriam stared at the sketches archived beside the note. One spiral resembled the layout of Domus Aurea. Another, a map of the village. One showed the same circular floral pattern from the 1971 altar. But it was the last one that sent chills down her spine, a star with 7 points. Labeled window. What kind of window? A memory, a warning, a portal no one knew. But every drawing had one thing in common, drawn by a hand that never stopped shaking. No signature. Just a single number written on the bottom right corner of each page. 314. That was Leora's ID in Domus Aurea. And it begged the question, was she trying to communicate? Or to contain something far more dangerous? The spirals weren't art. They were cages. But were they meant to trap her or protect us? Miriam followed the trail north into a place so remote. Even the trees seemed to whisper warnings. Her car stalled 2 miles from the signal. Snow blanketed everything except one crooked path leading to a cabin long forgotten by maps. The hinges creaked as she pushed the door open, revealing a silence so deep it felt conscious. Dust clung to the air. No furniture, no signs of life. Just a faint metallic scent, copper and decay. And then she saw it. On the far wall, scrawled in what could only be dried blood. 5 words frozen in time. Do not bring the light back. The lettering was erratic, scraped violently into the wood with a blade, like a last act of someone who knew they wouldn't leave alive. Miriam's breath caught. That phrase, it wasn't a warning. It was a plea. She approached slowly, noticing beneath the message 7 small handprints. Children's handprints. The 7th one smaller. Leora's size. It didn't make sense. Was the light meant to save, or to destroy outside? A storm began to rise. But Miriam didn't move. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what's hiding in the dark. It's what you've already brought into the light. The video ends not with screams, not with jump cuts or blood, but with something far worse. A quiet shot inside Miriam's car. Windshield fogged by her breath. Fingers trembling on the steering wheel. Her face is pale. Hollowed. Not from fear, but realization. She stares at the camera, eyes glassy, voice barely above a whisper. She's alive. But they never wanted her to be. Silence. Then static. But it's too late. The damage is done. That single sentence cracks through the audience's spine like ice water. The comments explode. Who is they? What did they do to her? Conspiracy forums light up. But something's different this time. Because this wasn't fiction. The GPS metadata was real. The fingerprints matched. And that voice, that final line, wasn't scripted. It was haunted. Raw. Like a survivor confessing too late. Viewers scroll back, freeze frame her eyes. Behind the panic, there's something else. A shadow in the rear seat, a shape in the woods. Or was it always inside her? You can click away, close the tab. But the last words linger. She's alive. And now, so is the truth. The screen fades to black. Silence stretches, not the comforting kind, but the kind that presses into your chest like something watching, waiting. Then, in white typewriter text, slow and deliberate, the final words appear. This documentary is based on unclassified interviews, partially burned documents, And one voice that never forgot. No music, no logo. Just that line. As if the film itself isn't just telling a story, but bearing witness. Viewers hold their breath, feeling something unspeakable crawling under their skin. Because now it's not just about what happened to Leora. It's about who buried it, and why. The phrasing "one voice that never forgot" becomes a rallying cry, echoed across social media, stitched onto Reddit threads, whispered in podcast recaps. But the eeriest part, no one knows whose voice it was. Miriam's, Judith's, or someone else entirely. It feels less like an ending, and more like an invocation. A key slipped under the door, and whether you believe it or not, the seed has been planted. In your mind, in your memory. And like the spirals she drew, it never stops turning. If you're still here, it means the story left something unsettled inside you, just like it did for us. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these aren't just forgotten names or buried files. Maybe they're warnings. Echoes. Questions we were never supposed to ask. But now that you know, what will you do with it? If this video made you feel something: confusion, anger, chills, don't let it end here. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you believe happened to Leora. Save this video before it disappears. And if you're brave enough to keep digging, hit subscribe. Because the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to look away. This isn't over. It never was.